Right, we're off. And what I want to do is introduce Paulette, who is Chief Executive of Haduma, one of the space cluster companies on the Harwell campus, which I think has just had its 10th birthday, Paulette. So congratulations to you on that. And the 10 years before, I think you were with Vodafone. So you're pretty steeped in tech and comms, and really interesting to see you migrate into this project. But we also have Martine, Dr. Martine Barons from Warwick University. Paulette is the principal investigator on the project they're going to describe tonight. Martine is a co-investigator, director of the Applied Statistics and Risk Unit in Warwick University. And I guess, Martine, your principal research interest is mathematical modeling and analysis. So it'd be really interesting to hear how this all goes together. And I think at this point, Paulette, if it's agreeable, I'll hand over to you to kick off the talk. Oh, sorry. One thing I missed. When Faith and I were thinking about the program for this year and planning the talks, we wanted to get off to a flying start. Yeah, got it? We wanted to create some buzz for Wanted Café Scientifique. But enough of that. Over to you, Paulette. Great to see you.
Thank you. How do I follow that, John? Okay, well, thank you very much for the invitation. Martine and myself would like to share with you a little about the project we're working on. I will switch off my camera to reserve broadband, but I will share a presentation slide. So if you bear with me for a few seconds. Well, I thought I'd put an agenda together so you could follow the flow of the presentation. I'll do a little bit of introduction about myself and the project, and then Martine would address the challenge that the project is looking to address. I will then share about the solution we're proposing, and then follow on with next steps, and there will be a Q&A session at the end to give you an opportunity to ask any questions that you may have. Well, as John mentioned, my background is telecoms and IT service management. I'm based at Harwell. I'm managing director, not CEO, but that's okay, John. And tonight, Martine, myself, who's from Warwick, the University of Warwick, will discuss the challenges of beekeeping management and the approach that our project is taking to help solve some of the problems that beekeepers encounter. And like I said, at the end of the talk, you will have an opportunity to ask any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Paulette.
Yes, sorry. So just to mention, the project is supported and funded by the Science and Technology Facility Council Food Network program. STFC is based at Harwell. They're also based in the northwest of the UK. And in July, we had the opportunity to present our project proposal to the FTFC Food Network. And we were successful in receiving some funding to advance the project idea. So that is basically what we will be sharing with you tonight. Over to you, Martine.
Thank you, Paulette. I don't know if any of you are old enough, like I am, to remember the days when you would go out in your parents' car and in the summer, the windscreen would be absolutely covered in insects. and it would be really difficult to get them off. They'd be almost welded on. It hasn't happened to me in a long time. This article here in the New York Times is really, really interesting. Some scientists decided that they had noticed this phenomenon, and they decided that they would try and measure the kind of decline in insects. And this is really, really hard to do. If you ever tried to count insects, it's really, really difficult. But what they did have is historic samples which have been taken by catch net. And they decided to drive up and down the roads with nets on top of their cars to try and catch them. And they had the genius idea, well, why don't we weigh them? And then we can actually get an idea of by how much the decline has happened. So that's, well, if you get the slides afterwards, it's well worth clicking on that link and having a look at that article. Very, very interesting. So the reasons that insects are declining isn't fully known, nor is the full extent of the losses. We do know that pollination is important and that we need to do something if we want to keep the insect levels at an appropriate level. Next slide, please, Paulette. Thank you. So I wonder, which of these would you miss the most if we didn't have them anymore? I'm very fond of nuts myself, but there's also, of course, grapes, which will make a fine wine or a lovely grape juice for you, and lots of other things. Coffee. I don't know if research would grind to a halt with no coffee, for example. Next slide, please. So honeybees are not the only pollinator, of course. There are lots of pollinators, but they are a key pollinator. So because they're managed by beekeepers, some people refer to them as livestock. We can do things with bees, honeybees, that we can't do with wild bees so easily. For example, we can treat them for disease. We can make sure they have enough food and so on in a very direct way. But bees have a fascinating life cycle. They're very complex in-hive dynamics from the different stages of development that the bees go through, the different jobs they have in the hive. They don't just hatch one day and fly the next. First of all, they have to be cleaning in the hive, and they are nurses to the larva, and then they get to be guard bees at the door, and finally they get to go out and fly and collect the nectar and the pollen and bring it back. So there are diseases and parasites that they are susceptible to. Environmental conditions can have a big effect. The weather is very key. It has to be warm enough for them to fly. It has to not be too windy. It has to be the right kind of weather to bring out the flowers, and so on and so forth. And also beekeeper management practices are very important. It's possible for beekeepers to actually spread disease on their bee suits if they're not careful. So if they're going from apiary to apiary, it's very common practice to have a particular bee suit for a particular apiary. So next, please. So here's a picture just describing so many different kinds of diseases, some of them more prevalent than others, some of them more difficult to treat than others. So the one thing that is very dangerous or very much in the top of beekeepers' minds is the Varroa destructor parasite, which makes its home on the larvae, and it feeds on the bees directly. But it's also a vector for the deformed wing virus, and if bees have deformed wings, they can't fly and they can't collect nectar and pollen efficiently for the hive, and so they don't have very long lives, and then the colony can become depleted. And nosema is another key concern that beekeepers have. Next slide, please. So there was a survey that was done to work out why whole colonies have died. And diseases in general are the most common given reason, but the next most common given reason is Varroa. And that's the same whether it's reported by the beekeepers or by the laboratories. There's a whole raft of possible reasons there, but those are the key ones. So next, please. So here's a lovely schematic that I found explaining how the Varroa mite infests the hive. So the queen will lay the egg, and then the worker bee will come along to look after the larva and then to cap the cell. And that's at the point at which a mite will drop in and attach itself to the developing larva. And then it will start laying eggs, and the original mite will pierce a hole in the larva for the baby mites to feed on. And then when the bee emerges, it's already infected, already got parasites on it. So a recent discovery was that It's not hemolymph, which is kind of blood for the bees that they feed on, but actually the body fat tissue. So next, please. So if we're going to do something useful for beekeepers, we need to know the kind of routines that they have, the kind of concerns that they have, and how they go about looking after their bees. So in the winter, it's cold like it is now, and bees keep warm by forming a cluster. And you can't open the hive because they will get too cold too quickly. So what you have to do is make sure they have enough food. If you've taken the honey off and they haven't had a chance to replenish it, you have to feed them with either syrup or with fondant, and you have to make sure that they've got enough food. But if you can't open the hive, lifting it or weighing it is the way to go. Mice will love to curl up in a nice warm hive, and in doing so will damage the hive by chewing it. And woodpeckers, if they get a taste for bees as an easy source of protein in the winter, they can make quick work of a wooden hive or even a polystyrene one. So you have to make sure that you've got protections in place. And of course, the weather, it can be a little bit inclement. There might be a big storm that might have knocked over the hives, or there might have been some falling branches or whatever that might have knocked them over. So you need to check that those are okay. Next slide, please. So spring, will spring come early? Will it come late? Will the bees survive if it's a late spring? Just really rejoicing over those early dandelions, because the bees can then come out and have something to eat. We treat them like weeds, don't we, the dandelions, but they are very important early nectar sources for bees. So once 10 degrees comes, you can have a quick little check and make sure that your colony has overwintered and is there. When it gets as high as 14, you can actually have a proper inspection, see how the Varroa load is, see any other diseases, any treatments you might need to apply, and you need to keep a record of all those treatments, of course. And then the Asian hornet is a pest, and you might want to put out some traps so that if an Asian hornet gets into your hives, it can kill thousands of bees very, very quickly. So that's something to be aware of. Next one, please. Summer is a very happy time for the bees. There are lots and lots of flowers out, so the colony is growing really fast. The queen is laying eggs at a huge rate. But if they get too tight for space, they'll begin to prepare to swarm. And this is where the queen leaves with a bundle of the workers, and they've raised some new queens to leave behind, and the old queen goes and creates a new colony. Commercial beekeepers are very focused on preventing swarming, and hobby beekeepers have different attitudes. Some of them say, well, if they swarm, they swarm, and others are really keen to stop that. So making extra space by putting what they call supers on the top of the hive, extra rooms essentially. You can split colonies once they get too big. You can actually raise the queens yourself and split the colonies so that they aren't too squashed. Or you can wait for them to swarm, and you can put out bait hives, because when they swarm, they go into a nearby tree usually or something like that. And then they scout out for a new place to live. If you've already provided them with a good place to live, then you might well capture them. So there's a bit of a gap between pollen supply in June. So we call it the June gap. So you might need to feed your bees in that time. So if you're a beekeeper and you're on bee base, they will send you out alerts if they think that the weather's been particularly bad, or if there's likelihood of starvation, and you'll get a notification in your inbox to go and check your hives. And in August, you're ready to harvest your honey. Next slide, please. So you've taken off the honey. So you really need to check that they've got enough food stores for the winter. So that might mean moving the hives to where there is some late flowers, maybe ivy, maybe heather. If you've split some of your colonies to keep them from swarming, if they're big enough to survive the winter, that's great. If not, you might want to combine them. You want to watch out for other bees robbing the honey. And you really need to check and get that Varroa level really low before they settle in for the winter. And this is where you've got to think again about the mice and the woodpeckers and add the defences that you need. And then you can settle back and make your mead. Next slide, please. So all this activity can be very time consuming. Now, for some hobby beekeepers, they'd say, well, why would I want to do anything else? The point of having bees is to go and look at them and to enjoy them. It's a bit like, you know, to do anything else would be like having a dog and asking somebody else to walk it for you. But for people with large apiaries or several apiaries, or the professional bee farmers, they want to keep their visits down to as minimum as necessary. And that's where we are hoping to make some progress here by understanding what the beekeepers need and providing a solution, which Paulette is about to tell us about.
Thank you, Martine. So, our approach. The concept diagram you can see on the screen represents a very high-level view of our long-term solution that we're proposing. In the beehives, we will install some Internet of Things sensors, and which includes camera to be able to monitor the conditions within the hives, such as the temperature inside the hives as well as outside, capture the sounds that the bees are making and the vibration, and also use cameras to see with infrared to be able to see inside the hives and monitor and watch the activities within. The other thing that we're looking to do, in order for that information from the sensors to be transferred to a cloud platform, we're also considering network connectivity. That may include 4G or 5G or long-range wide area network. We're also considering satellite communication for where the hives are located in remote locations where there's no mobile telephony connectivity. The other space technology that we're looking to use is GPS, global positioning systems, which will enable the beekeeper to know at any given time where the hive is located. It can also be used to ensure that the hives aren't stolen, because you can track and trace the hives using GPS. The great thing about having sensors in the hive, it will enable us to be able to measure a number of different conditions within the hives. Looking at the temperature, we will be able to see exactly what the temperature in the hives are. We will also be able to indicate and be warned at an early stage when the bees are preparing to swarm and need to be separated. So this image showing the long-term view, the data would then be transferred from the hive to a cloud platform. The cloud platform will then analyze the data, and the beekeeper and a number of other end users using mobile devices or computer will be able to display the information on the screen. Later on in the presentation slides, you will have an example of some of the data that you can display. So this is the long-term view. And short-term view, what we are looking to do is to break the long-term ambition for the project into more manageable sections for this project, which is called a scoping project. We've already started to engage with some beekeepers, commercial as well as hobbyists. And what we're proposing is to be able to capture some information from them based on their requirements, how they manage their hives at the moment, the type of features or things they would like to see to enable them to be more automated in the day-to-day task. So that is something that we're really keen to do and work with the beekeepers. We're also interested in identifying specific conditions within the hive. As Martine has mentioned, there is the Varroa mite, which is problematic. And if we can detect that mite early on in the process, we can help to reduce the impact it would have on the colony. In order to break down the work that we would like to do, what we've done is basically separated some of the activities into what is referred to as work packages. So during this period, we are currently as I mentioned, engaging with beekeepers. Martine's team is working on a questionnaire, and that questionnaire we will send to beekeepers for them to respond to. The information we captured from the questionnaire will enable us to identify the top 10 or a number of key conditions or problems that the beekeepers would like us to address using the sensors that we will develop and install into the hives. So moving on to the next slide, this is an indication of the type of sensors that we would actually have installed in the hive. We would be able to measure things like the weight of the hive, either during the winter to indicate whether additional food store is required for the bees, or whether the honey that is being produced should be harvested. We can also measure the temperature and the pressure, humidity within the hive. The acoustic sensor would help us to be able to have audio within the hive so that we can hear the sound of the bees, and also if there is additional activity, like as mentioned, where they are beginning to swarm, the increase in the sound level would indicate to us that there is some hyper activities occurring within the hives. We can also use some sensors to detect whether there's movement within the hive. As Martine mentioned, if the hive was blown over, we will be able to detect that because it's no longer upright. So we will be able to detect that there's an issue with the hive, and the beekeeper can then go and visually inspect the hive. The great thing about having sensors is it will help to reduce the number of visits you would have to make to the hive. So during the winter, where it might be snowing and the weather conditions aren't brilliant, and you look outside and think, whoa, maybe I skip going out today. Well, you can whip out your mobile phone, or you can open up your laptop and you can see what's happening in your hive. Easy. We turn into space technology. The great thing about satellite Earth observation data and remote sensing, we have a number of satellites in orbit monitoring different activities on Earth. With Earth observation data, we can use that technology to, first of all, identify suitable locations to place the hives. And where we have hives, we can also measure the environment around the hives to detect whether or not there's excess pollutants or maybe pesticides, etc., that will have an impact on the honey, but also on the bees. So that's one of the great things about using satellite Earth observation data and remote sensing. The other space technology, as I mentioned earlier, with GNSS, the Global Satellite Navigation Systems, or GPS, is we will be able to have a GPS placed in the hive. And if the hive is moved, you will be able to track that hive and locate it, especially if it was moved by someone who shouldn't move it. You'll be able to find quite easily where your hive is located because you can track it again with the application on your mobile phone or on your computer dashboard. So how do we map those technologies with the 4 seasons that Martine just mentioned? Well, during the winter, as I mentioned, you have a camera and you have the temperature condition. So you can measure what condition is within the hive. Is it warm enough? Is it a warm enough environment for the bees? I know that some beekeepers, depending on the location where they're based, they normally insulate the hives to protect it from really extreme cold weather. We don't have that type of weather conditions in the UK, so it's possible you may just leave, the beekeepers in the UK would just leave the hives exposed. again, the sensor for weight, measuring the weight, we can find out in the winter, do we have enough food store, or do we need to replenish the food for the bees? The acoustic and the motion sensor and the accelerometer, we can detect whether or not the hive has been overturned by high winds, or maybe being attacked by woodpecker or mouse, because again, you have the camera and you also have the sound sensor where you can actually hear the different types of sound being emitted from the hive. In the autumn, again, similar, you can actually use the camera. In the spring, again, you can have the temperature, you can measure the temperature, the acoustics. You'll be aware of when the colony is preparing to swarm, because you're hearing the different sounds. And throughout the year, all of that information is being captured by the different sensors, transferred to a cloud server, and that data is being collected so you can have historic information that you can review, and therefore you can build up a pattern to begin to recognize when certain things either out of the normal are occurring, or when you have a general pattern of unique events occurring within the hive. And as mentioned, the space technology using the GPS for security purpose and tracking and tracing your hive. Now, the great thing about having co-investigators, it isn't just Martine and myself. We're working with STFC based at Harwell, and they've got some amazing experts. They're helping us out with the cybersecurity element, looking at the edge computing, that is the processing capability that we would implement within the hive, so that that data can be analyzed and captured and transmitted to the cloud platform. And again, also, how do you integrate those sensors with the computing processor and incorporate the security? So the great thing is to be able to visualize that data that's being captured so that it's understood by the beekeeper on the mobile phone or whichever mobile device they choose to use. This is just an example of the type of data or what the dashboard will look like. You can have on your tablet information from the sensors telling you what the weather condition is like outside the hive, what the temperature is like inside. Is it humid? Are the bees calm? Are they agitated? And if so, what is doing it? And because you've been monitoring your bees on a regular basis using this data, you would be able to see where there's unusual readings. And the great thing is as well, with the sensors, you can have it alert you if there's unusual conditions occurring within the hive. So you don't have to be looking at the data or the dashboard every 5 seconds. You can wait to be alerted when a certain threshold has been met. Now, in addition to the data being captured by the sensors, we're also looking to monitor the sensors, because if a sensor fails, it would be good to be able to know that there is an issue and there might be gaps in the data that is being collected. So moving on to next steps. What are we looking for? What are we hoping to do? And that's where the interviews and the surveys come in, and participation with beekeepers, hobbyists, as well as commercial. Now, interviews, because of the COVID-19 situation and social distancing, etc., we're not proposing to do face-to-face interviews, but we will do telephone and as well as conference calls using facilities such as Zoom, Skype, etc. And for the surveys, we're looking to have the survey that could be accessed via a mobile phone or computer. So right now, what I would do is hand it back over to Martine to finish off on how you can help.
Thank you, Paulette. That was great. Now, the biggest danger for our project is that we install in the hive sensors that are easy to find and easy to make, but they don't tell you anything useful from a beekeeper perspective. So what we really want to do is to hear from as many beekeepers as possible, as Paulette said, both commercial and hobby beekeepers, keepers of large numbers of hives and small, of all ages if possible, so that we can really understand what the demand is likely to be. What are the priorities for beekeepers? Is it, as we suspect, is it Varroa and swarming? Are those the things that we can't detect presently that would be of most use? Or are there other things? We have heard from the commercial beekeepers, they really want to get their hive inspections down to 5 a year. Now that's probably a very different priority than some of our hobbyists who just love going out. But we need to understand the breadth of opinion and the priorities of beekeepers. So if you are a beekeeper, please let us know that we can send you, when it's finalized, the survey, and give us your opinion to really help us to push this forward in the right direction. So if you're not a beekeeper, would you like to become one? Doesn't this sound exciting? All this hives and beautiful bees and lovely honey? Well, the British Beekeepers Association is the place to go for training, for advice, and for enthusiasm. So what if you can't become a beekeeper, or you don't want to for any reason? Well, we can all do something, can't we? Those dandelions, they're not weeds. They are precious nectar sources for the bees. And if you can stand to have them in your grass, please do. And if not, can you dig them up and put them in the grass verge outside your house so they can grow peacefully there? So we can all help bees, not just honeybees, but also all kinds of bees, solitary bees, hoverflies and so on, by planting flowers and trying to get in our gardens a sort of a nectar flow, so there's something blooming all the time. Some of the more modern flowers have been bred in such a way that they don't actually provide very useful nectar sources. So if you're thinking of planting for bees, do check out the British Beekeeping Association's advice on gardening for bees, and I'll point you in the right direction. Thank you.
Thanks, Martine.
Wow.
So,
Sorry.
just to finish off, this is just a slide showing you the different partners that we have. STFC, Hartree Centre in the Northwest, the University of Warwick, and also the Open University. And we have another SME, Opti Farm, who actually specialize in monitoring livestock, chickens of all things. So they are familiar with using sensors to monitor livestock. So we do have a diverse group of knowledgeable, experienced investigators working on the project. So we're bringing our unique capabilities and experience into the project. The last slide, of course, has our details, but we're open for questions. Thank you, and I hope you found the presentation interesting.
Martine, Paulette, that was fantastic. That was a treat. And you are clearly a very high-powered team. I think for sure it was a great talk, great slides, and I'm sure there'll be some great questions and interesting answers to come from you too. And Faith, do you remember Paulette told us how this thing started, and it was to do with mentoring. Can you just capture how this got going, Paulette?
Oh, sure. Yeah, as part of my giving back to the business community, a few years ago, I was mentoring I was part of a mentoring group in London. I used to travel down to London every so often to mentor business startups. And there was one individual who had just, he used to work, he was a banker in the city. That I think he was a banker in the city, but he decided to leave banking and start beekeeping. And so he's a beekeeper producing honey. He's a commercial beekeeper, a young gentleman producing honey, which he's actually selling in Harrods and a number of other supermarkets. So when I was mentoring him on the business side, we were talking, and I asked him if he had considered how he would be able to automate some of the day-to-day activities he was performing in order to reduce the amount of effort he was putting into, from the hive straight through to his warehouse into his retail. And I was talking to him about how he could use technology to automate quite a bit of that activity. And then I said to him also that, by the way, if you had sensors in your hives, you could do so much more, because you'll be able to understand what is happening in the hives. And then you can trace that through, especially as he was also working with other beekeepers to collect their honey, which he then processed and sold on as well. And to be able to track and trace the authenticity of the honey from the other beekeepers. And the way he would be able to do that is using sensors and technology. So that's how it came about. And I was thinking about it and putting together the ideas. And then last summer, July, we had the opportunity to pitch the idea to the STFC Food Network, and was successful in having the proposal accepted. So that's how it came about. And then that's how I met Martine as well.
Great. Paulette, can you put your video on, please?
Oh, yeah, sorry. I forgot to do that.
Nice to see you.
Well, I think it's a brilliant, absolutely brilliant project. And I have to say, my Uncle Peter long since departed from Fruchy in Fife, but a beekeeper would be turning in his grave at the idea of all these contraptions attached to his beehives. But moving on, and actually maybe at some point we can bring Dawn in as well, because I think in my mind of the two beehives outside the HQ office on the Harwell campus, and my tagline slogan for them is, "This is not just a beehive, this is a Harwell beehive." And Martine, I think in a way, you are not just a mathematical modeler. You have clearly got special backstory insights that bring you into this as well.
Yeah. In fact, I've been researching how to make decisions under uncertainty, which is kind of topical at the moment. So that's how do you handle uncertainty? How do you present uncertainty to decision makers such that they don't just say, "Oh well, if you see uncertainty, you don't know what you're talking about, do you?" And one of the application areas is food security, thinking a lot about people and using food banks and so on, which again is very topical right in the middle of the pandemic. But also in terms of sustainable production, which is where I came across the sort of the bees and the beehive stuff. So I've been researching that for about 5 years, and I've been a member of my local beekeeping association. I couldn't find the photograph. I was going to put it into the presentation. I've even been to the association Apiary. I don't keep bees myself, but I do read through the British Beekeeping Association magazine every month when it comes, to keep up on the research side about how things are developing and what the key interest is. And interestingly enough, in June 2019 issue, there was an Internet of Bees issue, which actually talked about exactly what we're trying to achieve here and gave a list of all the the current offerings and what they did and didn't do. And so, for example, most of them do weight and temperature and humidity, and the reason they do those is because those are easy to do. None of them are trying to, at the moment, to detect Varroa or swarming. We suspect those might be key interests, but we're going to wait and hear from our beekeepers. We don't want to jump in and be wrong, because the thing that's really, really important, particularly in the mathematical modelling world, but I guess for all science, is to begin and end with the problem owner. So the problem has to be the problem that the problem owner needs to solve, and the solution has to be a solution that the problem owner can make use of. And that's what we're aiming for here.
That's correct. And I take the similar approach. I firmly believe that it is, if you have the problem, you try and identify the right technology to solve that problem, as opposed to come up with a technology solution and then look around for the problem, because that's the wrong way to do it. And that's why we always try and engage the end user and the stakeholders within our technology projects, because it is crucial that we understand what the problem is. I noticed there's loads of questions, so if someone would like to read.
Shall I start?
Faith, you're in charge.
Okay. Can I just ask my own question first, just a bit about the scale of the project, both in terms of time scale, but also how many beekeepers you're hoping to involve and engage?
Okay, so the time scale for this scoping project, and it's referred to as a scoping project because it's more to do with research and information gathering. So that is 9 months.
Okay.
We've just finished the first 3 months. So now we're moving into the second quarter. And the size of the project actually is, we're looking to develop some commercially off-the-shelf sensors to build a sensor kit, which we can then install in some hives, one at Harwell and maybe in some other locations, so that we can have a wide spread of readings, and then we will capture that information. So we're hoping to be able to do that on a small scale during the 9 months project. And then to follow on from this 9-month project, we will look for a larger funding opportunity to widen it and actually develop some proper, bigger sensor kits, looking at specific conditions within the hive. So like, for instance, to be able to detect and identify the Varroa mite.
Okay, that's one of another question here, actually. Okay, I think there's a question about how we pass your details on to hobby beekeepers. We know, but presumably that was on a slide, I think, wasn't it?
It was on the last slide.
You're very welcome to
Sorry?
emails that we've provided to get in touch and say, you're very welcome to use the email addresses we provided to get in touch for any reason, whatever, but especially if you want to be put on the list to receive a survey link in a couple of weeks' time.
Fine. Is there scope to do research based on the pooled data from all of the hives to see whether, for example, treating for Varroa should be earlier, is it better earlier than later? And do warm temperatures lead to greater honey production, etc.?
And that is the
It would be very straightforward. I think basic data analysis to see some correlations there. I mean, causation, of course, is much more complicated to demonstrate, but we could definitely do some correlations and sort of develop some hypotheses along those lines. That would be very easy to do.
Yeah.
Okay. Next question. There's a disconnect between measurements and causes, e.g. weight. How do you tell whether this is due to food store, rainfall, or wind load?
One of the things that we would do is when we install the weight, the tray to weigh the hive, we would actually, how should I say, we will make sure that the measurements, we balance it out. So we would basically, I've lost the word. Help me, Martine.
I think the dynamics of the weight would tell you a lot, because if it was wind, it would be transient. If it was snow, even, it would be transient. It would go away again. It wouldn't be a steady decline in the weight which you would expect for bees finishing their food. Same if you're using the weight to, to measure the honey. You would expect a steady increase in the honey, and there are measurements you can do with that, and you can see where there's been bad weather, for example, and the weight goes down again because they're actually consuming the honey because they haven't got pollen and nectar to bring in. So I think that would give you a lot of clues. Obviously, you'd have to do some testing on that, but that would be something that was the first thing I would think of to do.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah. What the word I was thinking of was calibrate. So when you install the scales, naturally you would do some measurements to see what the weight is of the hive compared to what the honey, when the honey is actually being produced, and then you'll be able to calibrate and understand when the scales are indicating that the honey is being produced and should be harvested. And during the winter, you should be able, from the start of when the food is in the hives and when it's being depleted, you should be able to tell the difference between the two.
Okay. Do you create your own sensors, or are they sourced? Can you obtain vanilla sensors which you configure, or is each sensor handcrafted for the job in hand?
The aim really is, currently we are looking to use commercially off-the-shelf sensors to build the kits. For specific conditions, i.e. using to identify the Varroa mite or maybe another type of pest, if there is a sensor already on the market, we would have to develop that sensor. And that's where the university, the Open University comes in. They've been working on some amazing products to be able to detect the genuine whiskey and a number of different things using specific types of sensors.
Please, could I come in with a question for Dawn? Dawn, can you ever see honey from Harwell being sold in Harrods?
Yes.
Short and sweet.
Scientific honey, I think we'll call it. We'll call it something quite trendy. So I'm going to have to leave in a minute, but that's been so informative, and thank you everyone for making me welcome on my first visit to this forum. I do hope in the future, though, what the work we're doing with our bees on Harwell, that we will use that data when it comes through and post it on the Harwell Hub and other forums online as well, so it is shared with everyone as well. So yeah, not only this forum, we will do it with Harwell as well.
Yeah, well, I'm working with, we're collaborating with James, who's actually managing the beehives at Harwell. So yeah.
And obviously he's got more bees on his farm in Wantage as well.
Correct. I've already spoken to him about that.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Join us again, Dawn. Thank you.
Will do. Thank you.
There are quite a lot of questions actually, so I'm going to have to start getting selective soon, I think. But just going down the list at the moment, have solutionbee.com not already done this?
Yes and no. So if you look at the British Beekeeping Association's June 2019 edition, you'll see there's a table of all the sensors that are currently available. All of them, almost all of them, do weight, temperature and humidity and very little else at the moment. So, and Solution B, they have ticked weight and temperature for that, and a graphical output. So there is still scope for something a bit more sophisticated. But yes, it's not that nobody's thought of this before.
Okay. And then there's one about neonicotinoids, which controversially have just been allowed again as an emergency measure to combat yellow leaf virus in sugar beet crops. What do you feel about that?
Well, the dose makes the poison, doesn't it? So actually getting, in experimental circumstances, getting to understand what is a field realistic dose of anything is really, really hard. And so whether neonicotinoids are as damaging or more damaging than older pesticides, which have been subjected to far less rigorous testing, is actually a controversial area in science. And I don't want to say, I know Dave Chandler is on the call, so I don't really want to say any more than that, because I'll be stepping outside my expertise into his. So I'll just leave it there. So it's not absolutely agreed by absolutely everybody that these are necessarily worse than what else we would use. So I think the use as well, I think it's not for flowering crops, is it? So
no, just sugar beet. Okay, then you mentioned the June gap for pollen. Are there particular plants that we could plant to help with that?
Well, I think the June gap tends to refer to really to wildflowers more. So if we have garden flowers that are June flowering, then that would be a great idea. I think the June gap is only quite small, it's a couple of weeks anyway. But at any time you might get a starvation alert from the British Beekeeping Association bee base, because the weather has been particularly cold for 2 or 3 weeks, for example, in the middle of August. So it's very up and down. We can do our best to plant in our gardens something which will flower early, something which will flower in the spring, something which will flower in the summer and the autumn, and so on. Keep it going as long as we can. Even sort of winter honeysuckles are great, but you know, we can't preclude this. But beekeepers are very adept at looking after the bees if that's the case.
Okay. Beekeepers keep out woodpeckers and mice during the winter using wire netting. PIR will also not discriminate between intruders. So that's more of a comment, I guess. But do you have anything to respond?
True.
True. Yeah. Okay. There's a question here about costs. What does the necessary equipment cost per hive? Which obviously could be quite an issue for a small scale beekeeper.
Yeah,
well,
that is one of the things that we will be researching in this scoping project. As we build the kit, we will look at the cost of each individual unit. Because at the end of the day, it has to be viable for the hobbyist as well as the commercial beekeeper. If it's going to cost you an awful lot of money and you don't actually make a savings, then it's not viable.
I think there's also possibilities then, not if you've got a large apiary, of having a sentinel hive. So, you know, in terms of things like you know, whether you're getting woodpecker attacks and so on, you might have one hive that you just do put all the sensors in, and then you sort of infer from those. There are lots of other ways of doing it, but we're very conscious that it has to have a cost benefit.
Okay, and can they be used in polystyrene as well as wooden hives?
Yeah.
As far as I know.
Right, thank you. Penny's just reminding us that all recent, most of the talks we've done on Zoom are available, but I will put that link in the newsletter. Right, so there's a longer one here, comment here. This is really interesting, though. There is work on the flip side of this on exposure to cell phone radiations producing biochemical changes in bees. There is now the potential to pinpoint radio frequency, electromagnetic fields, electricity and radiation from the cell phone sensors directly into the hives. This unknown could potentially have consequences we're not yet fully aware of. I guess that's
true.
We're not planning on putting mobile phones into the hives.
No.
No.
But
Right.
Paulette, could you ever see that? I know you mentioned livestock as one of the possible next steps, different directions. Will there ever be a day when the bees have a little implant, tiny little chip that gives you the feedback of what they're up to and where they're going and whether they're up to no good?
Well, in actual fact, there are research going on right now where you can have a nano chip on the back of the bee, and you can have it embedded on the back of the bee, and as the bee go out foraging, you can actually pinpoint at any given time where it is, so you can track and see how far the bee will go to find food before returning to the hive. So that is possible now.
Amazing. And actually, that gives you an opportunity to just highlight my favorite piece of what you're doing, that you can count the bees out in the morning and count them back at night. And I really, really just dream of the day when you give them all a name. That's my challenge to you on the project.
Well, So if you have 20,000 bees in a hive,
And they don't live very long, and we have lots of new bees being born.
Okay, so it's hard. You guys are so smart. If it was easy, anybody could do it.
well, give it time.
We could definitely develop an algorithm which would allocate a unique name to each bee. It might be very long and unpronounceable, but we could do it.
There is actually a company, a small robot company, somewhere near Salisbury, and they send one robot out into a field of a crop field to take photographs, and then they send another robot out to electrocute the weeds. And they've given them all a name. So that there's one robot called Tom, there's another robot called Dick, there's another one called Harry. I think there's a new one called Wilma as well. So go for it with the bees.
Okay, back to the questions. There's a question about whether the sensors may impact on the bees. This person knows a beekeeper who's put cameras inside his hive and the bees avoid them. Is that a risk?
Oh, so where exactly has the camera been placed? Just out of interest.
And
what size cameras?
Doesn't say.
I'm not 100% sure, but I do know that he's put a small camera inside the beehive, and the bees are just avoiding the whole area. It's quite crazy, really.
Oh wow, that's something to note for when, because
Yeah.
I'm actually a local beekeeper and a member of the local association, so
okay.
Excellent.
I'll be in contact tomorrow.
Great.
Yeah, it would be good to speak with you. Yeah.
Okay.
Hopefully we've got a few beekeepers on here who will be recruited. So someone says that they're really interested to hear about your work on uncertainty generally, Martine, and that we should have you back on that topic for another evening. And going back to bees though, yeah, good, okay, that'd be great. We're always looking for speakers. What about the energy budget for remote monitors? Temperature and weight are fine, but chemical sensors and high bandwidth sounds as if they need quite a bit of power. Varroa and advanced warning of swarming would be great, but do we have an appropriate measurement?
And those are the kind of things that we'll be looking further into, especially the energy source for the nodes that will be capturing the data. Mm-hmm. It will have to be low power. And some of the options we're considering is, do we have solar power to be able to recharge the batteries, and especially long life or low energy consuming batteries, because once you put the sensors out to the hive, you really don't want to have to be changing batteries every 2 weeks or so. So with the Internet of Things and a lot of the sensors that are on the market now, there's some amazing technology out there where you can basically leave them for 5 years, 10 years.
Do you think, actually, we've had some requests, if you could actually write in the chat the email, the contact information, because otherwise people will have to look at the presentation, or I don't know.
Okay, I'll do that.
I've done that already.
You have done, okay. That would be
I'll put my contact details.
That's great. Thanks very much. Can you describe the nature of the weight sensor? Does the whole hive sit on a scale?
Well, I haven't seen it.
Right.
Yes, it's a base plate, so the hive will sit on the scale.
Okay.
And thank you for the heads up on the radio frequency. I've picked up that paper. Thank you, whoever contributed that.
I've just put my details in.
Oh yes, thank you. Okay, we're coming to the end of the questions now, I think. There's a reference to an article about planting bees on the BBKA website. People can read that if they want to know. And then someone makes a comment, some bee behaviours can be described or predicted by sound and vibration.
Yeah, there's some very interesting recent work that's been published on different vibration types, which give you a warning for swarming. So we're hoping that we might be able to make use of that new research to get an early warning system up and running.
Okay. And finally, is there a fuel cell that runs on honey?
It's called people.
Oh, sorry, there's one more comment here about Arduino sensors that you mentioned. They're very low power. This person, Colin, is developing a harvest mouse logging system with RFID and PIR sensors to SD card recording that run off 4 AA batteries for at least 6 months. So solar power would be overload.
Oh, okay. By all means, reach out to us and we'll be happy to discuss further what you're doing and see whether or not we can maybe incorporate it as a test into what we're doing. We're quite happy to collaborate.
Great. I think that's, hopefully I've picked up most of them there. I think that brings us to the end of the questions. John?
Thank you, brilliant. And I really, really, really big thank yous, Paulette and Martine. I think really fascinating project, but a great talk. You've both done fantastic and got us Wanted Café Scientifique off to a great start for the year. I must admit, I never expected to hear the phrase track and trace in this talk tonight. So well done squeezing that in, Paulette. And by the way, seeing Caroline Callard on the call from RAL Space, just to mention, the STFC Food Network, I think nobody knows whether funding for these things will go on forever or for a month or a year or whatever, but I'm involved in one project from the network where we started with a scoping study to look at the food supply chain in India. And it wasn't a big budget, but we, from the scoping study, enabled us to put forward another proposal, which we're still working on. It's a little bit tricky, but Zoom calls to our friends in India every couple of weeks, and we're moving along. And that the funding for that was about $1 million. I forget what it is in pounds, but there is real scope with the STFC Food Network. And actually, reason for mentioning Caroline, one of the heat-seeking experts in that project is an internationally regarded expert in RAL space in thermal modeling and heat transfer and insulation. And in a sense, his day job is protecting satellites being fried by the sun. So all we're asking him to do in this Indian food supply project is do the same for a tomato or two, to just get them from the farm to the consumer in a decent kind of condition. So shout out, commendation for the STFC Food Network. But thank you so much for really such an interesting talk. Thank you so much to everybody who joined the call.
Don, can I just mention sorry. We've got Sam Hatfield here who's doing the talk next.
You're ahead of me. I was just going to say.
Oh, sorry.
I actually was going to say two things. A huge thank you to you for all you've done, and because I never have captured it in my head. What's next?
It's on weather prediction, but Sam is actually here, so he can give a little preview himself. Over to you, Sam.
Hi there. Yeah, that was a really lovely talk. I'll also be talking a little bit about satellites, but from a completely different perspective, which is monitoring the Earth's weather and climate from space. That'll be just one aspect of what I'll be talking about next month. I'm basically going to give a kind of history of weather prediction, focusing on how we use computers and observations like satellites, as I said. I'll also be talking a little bit about how we use pretty much the same tools to predict climate change, and what are the main developments in weather prediction now and in the future. So I have a kind of insider's perspective because I'm currently a researcher at the European Weather Centre, which is based just outside of Reading. So I hope you can all come. It'd be great to have an attendance of 60 or so, just like tonight. And I'm really looking forward to it.
Great. Thanks very much, Sam. I'm very glad you could join us this evening.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation.
Sam, if you reach out to me on LinkedIn, if you're on LinkedIn,
Yeah.
and post something about your event next month, I'll share it with my network.
Oh, brilliant. Thanks.
So hopefully you'll get equally high numbers.
That would be great.
Brilliant.
This is all getting better and better. What a wonderful community. But I think, Faith, unless there's anything else for now.
I think that's it.
Thank you, Paulette. Thank you, Martine. Thank you, Faith. Thank you all very, very much indeed. Absolutely great to see you. Cheers. Happy New Year. All the best.
Thank you for the invitation. Thanks. It was great.
Thank you both, our speakers. Brilliant.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
See you next month.